First of all, Malini, I think we need to sort of explain to folks who may not be quite familiar with the new terminology at Jim Beam, the James B. Beam Distilling Company. What exactly is it, and what does it cover within the Beam Suntory portfolio?
Yeah, so James B. Beam Distilling Company is actually the original name of the company coming out of Prohibition. And we've spent the last couple of months and probably the good part of the last year as we've thought about how do we bring the full portfolio back in its right. And we've gone back to the James B. Beam Distilling Company as our original name. And traditionally, we've just used Jim Beam. And Jim Beam is a flagship. It's the lifeblood of our company. But James B. Beam is really intended to give us the room and space to talk not only about our 225 years of whiskey making heritage, the family stories, and the breadth and depth of the full portfolio. So from a portfolio perspective, it will encompass all of the brands. So we talk about Jim Beam, but also Old Tub, which was the original coming out of Prohibition. And then we also have the small batch collection, which would have all of the brands that Booker started with, Basil Hayden's, Knob Creek, Booker's, and Baker's. And then we've had additions since then in Legent, Little Book, and now as we think about looking forward, there are other brands that we're looking at creating as well as nurturing through, and then we would also take the brands that we've kind of brought under our wing in the Old Crows, the Old Granddads. So it's really a matter of taking a look at the 225 years of whiskey making, whether it's stewarding those brands or brands that we've created from the Beam family, and really thinking about how we bring those into the future.
So the easiest way to explain it is it's basically everything in Kentucky that isn't made in Loretto at Maker's Mark.
Yes.
Which is run as a separate organization within Beam Suntory.
Correct.
How will this figure into the new visitor center in Clermont that's going to replace the American Stillhouse?
Yeah, so that's when I said the last year or so. This is a couple of years in the making, but really what it is our opportunity to we were going to do the opening of the craft distillery. So the Fred Noe Craft Distillery was underway, and that is really to enable a lot of our smaller brands. So as Jim Beam continues to grow, and we have a big facility, it allowed very little flexibility in terms of experimentation and how we want to, maybe try something that we don't know how it's going to go. When you have that big of an operation, it is highly disruptive to do that. And so it's become a really important part of our strategy to say, our brands, the big ones, Jim Beam, even Basil Hayden and Knob Creek are starting to get to a size of good scale, but we still wanted to be able to experiment, work with different distillation parameters, different barrel aging, etc. But really the craft distillery is going to enable us to do that. But in doing so, we wanted to look at how do we bring this campus experience to life? So I would say that James B. Beam Distilling Company will be the new name, where we used to, I think American Stillhouse will be renamed American Outpost. And that's just going back to what it was called when at the original start of things. So a lot of it is just leaning back into our history and looking at what stories we want to tell and how do we express the full breadth of our portfolio. So that's what, when we come back in late summer next year, what it will be rebranded as James B. Beam Distilling Company. We will have a new consumer experience. We'll have kitchen table, which is our new food and beverage space, and it will be 5,000 square feet, really in beautiful views, but a lot of the food that the family kind of has grown up around and will be very skewed to locally sourced and supporting kind of the local community in Kentucky. So really excited about what that has. And then there will be the craft distillery, as well as the American Outpost will be the revived American Stillhouse in terms of retail and tasting rooms.
How much of the craft distillery that's being built is being repurposed from the old micro distillery that was part of the tours at the American Stillhouse?
There are parts of it. I would need to check if on the exact pieces there are, but there's a lot that has gone in. So it's new construction completely. There are a couple of key elements that are pulled in, but essentially most of it is new and state of the art. We have some historic stills and equipment that we'll continue to keep. But in general, most of it is really about building, a bottoms up, giving us the state of the art technology and the distillation abilities to let Fred and Freddie kind of work their magic.
Now, that time's in right now, everything's closed for construction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we got word just a few hours before this interview that the Kentucky Bourbon Festival has announced its 2021 dates for mid-September, the 16th through the 19th. Do you think you can make it?
I think so. I think next year will be a big year. So obviously construction is underway, and we're targeting late summer as the timing when we should be, able to kind of open our doors again, assuming COVID-19 is under control. But yeah, I think this would be, it's an important time, and knowing that Bourbon Heritage Month is right around then, what we want to do in September is...
Distillery took 120 days or so to build back in 1935. It took more than 2 years to plan and build the Jim Beam American Stillhouse, which honors 7 generations of the Beam family's master distillers, and the extended Beam family spread out through distilleries around Kentucky.
What's the decision behind that? Because that really had only been open for a handful of years.
Yeah, so ultimately the decision was our lease was up for renewal. And as we were thinking about long-term, because I would say none of these decisions for us are about a year or 2 years. They're actually thinking about what is it that we're building and how do we get there in the long term. And so right now, our focus and our investment has been put into the Clermont campus because that is, our home place. And it's really about how do we make that experience embody everything that we want people to know and feel coming from the James Beam Distilling Company. And so as the lease came up for renewal, it was really a conversation around, is this the experience, and is there an extension that naturally fits today? And I think the answer was not really. Even if we were gonna continue the lease, we would actually rethink the whole experience and presence there. And so we were, honestly, we're just saying, let's actually make the decision to not renew the lease here, focus our efforts in Clermont, get this up and running. And meanwhile, I do think that a presence in Louisville for us long term is definitely a part of the plan, and it will probably be reimagined and an extension rather than replicating what happens in Clermont. We'll probably look to either enhance or create something that actually is complementary to the experience that we have in Clermont.
That brings up an interesting point, because for many, many years, once a distillery in Kentucky built a visitor center, that was it until you needed to expand a few years later. But now we're seeing, with what you're doing in both Clermont and Louisville, and what we're seeing around Kentucky, we're seeing these experiences being reimagined and redesigned every 5 to 7 years or so in some cases. And I'm just throwing that time period out as a ballpark, but every few years we're seeing these properties being freshened up or changed around. Is that because you want to get people to keep coming back, or to attract new folks? What's the thinking that's going into this?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think, and if we look at just the history of whiskey, the last 10 years has been, a really exciting time for the bourbon category specifically. And as we look at the growth that's happening in the category, there's a lot of new people coming in to try to explore and learn about bourbon. And there are bourbon drinkers that have been around for a really long time that are kind of probably amused that everyone else is hip to the game, right? And I think part of it is the category is continuing to grow, and there's so much potential in making sure that people understand that bourbon isn't a one-note thing. American whiskey, and I say that intentionally, is the inclusion of rye and American single malt and all the different things that we're seeing played around within the category are creating interest and connoisseurship in a way that I don't think we've seen in the more recent history. And so I think that categorically, when you look at it, the super premium categories are also where we are seeing a lot of growth. And with that comes a richness of experience that you want to have with it. So I do think that the Bourbon Trail in general, everyone is upping their game. And I think that's a good thing for the category. I think it will attract people to come, think of it as a destination, a really neat experience you can have, and actually not different to Napa. Or when you go to wine country, you can go from place to place, experience a little bit about each of the different distilleries, but also whiskey making, and then enjoy great whiskey along the way. So I do think that this is something that you will want to continue to build and reimagine to keep excitement in the category and to keep things fresh. But for us, I think it's a really big opportunity for us to, really unlock the potential of the full portfolio, where I think our focus had been, primarily on Jim Beam, and there was a little bit of small batch. I think there's an opportunity to showcase that there's so much about bourbon, and we have so much in our portfolio, whether you want something that's a bit more approachable like a Basil Hayden's, or if you want to go uncut, unfiltered and go to Booker's, right? There's a lot for people. And I think that Beam's approach, specifically the James Beam Distilling Company, is trying to find what works for you and what you like, and being able to explore that in a really welcoming and fun way. So that's really what our aim is.
There's one technical question I sort of need to ask you. How are you guys holding up in terms of production? Because I know we're seeing some brands that are having shortages because of problems getting bottles out. Because of COVID and health restrictions that are in place at the various plants, we're seeing some whiskeys that are in short supply. How is the Beam portfolio holding up in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, in terms of what we will look at from a plant perspective, we'll always put the health and safety of employees first and foremost. And that has been the case throughout. We've been, fortunate that ultimately we run, a pretty big facility and can kind of weather the storms. But in general, I think we're, I would say we're holding up really well. And I would continue to say that as the whiskey category continues to grow, it's really important that we keep pace.
So the inventory is flowing in terms of not only the liquid, but the bottles, the corks, and everything else that you've got to get into your bottling plants to be able to actually get product out to the market.
Yeah, I think it's probably, there's probably hiccups along the way, but in general, when I think about what we're actually looking to do, it's really engaging consumers in an experience. We're trying to get the best whiskey out to market as regularly and clearly as possible, and I think we're doing a good job.
One final question I've got to ask you, and I ask this for pretty much every time I talk to somebody who works for Beam. What's your best Fred Noe story?
Well, my best Fred Noe story, I'll say this is, it's very telling. So I met him, we do our national sales conference every year in Vegas. And it was probably 4 years ago, and I was not working on the Beam business at the time. And I was walking around, we sat down at a blackjack table, and Fred was sitting there. I'd never met him before. So a colleague of ours introduced the two of us, and we started just playing blackjack and talking. And of course, we were drinking good bourbon. And what I was completely taken by was just the disarming nature of Fred. So, someone that has the family legacy, the skill, the name behind him is probably one of the warmest people I've ever met in my life. And I told him that day, I was like, you make me feel at home. You make me feel like I'm with my father. And it was it was one of those things, we just had such a great time. It was really fun, but it was very comfortable for meeting someone the first time. And it was interesting because when I took this role, the same thing held true. He was so welcoming as I went to Clermont and kind of got my induction to, meet the teams and learn about the business and the whiskey making. And it was the same thing all over again. But it was very telling. And now when we think about, and when people ask me, what is it that you want people to remember about the experience when they come out, and it is that welcoming feeling, because I think it is so true of the Beam and Noe families, that there is a genuine love of bourbon and the desire to share it. And I feel like it permeates everything that we do. And so I have so many fun Fred stories, but that's probably the one that embodies who I think he is in a nutshell.
At least that's the one you can tell in public, right? Who's the better blackjack player, though, you or Fred?
Oh, for sure him. No doubt.
Malini Patel, the managing director of the James Beam Distilling Company, thank you for joining us on this, and best of luck with the construction project. We can't wait to see what you come up with this time next year.
Yeah, I would love to have you there.